Greetings and welcome back to 303 in Junior English. We now turn to page 872, 873, and the poet that many believe is the greatest American poet of them all, Robert Frost. Let's introduce you to this poet. If numbers matter, and sometimes they do, just flip through the next few pages and see the number of poems of this poet. Notice, for example, with T.S. Eliot, we get one poem. With W.H. Auden, we get one poem. But notice the number of titles that we are going to address. We've got several poems, and then finally, we have a very famous speech that Frost gave, at the famous inauguration of John F. Kennedy. So let's take a look at Robert Frost. Notice your dates, 1874 to 1963. You'll notice that several of these poets we're reading lived a long time through the 20th century. In becoming one of, I'm reading now with you on 873, in becoming one of America's most loved and respected poets, Robert Frost displayed the same persistence and determination exhibited by the rural New Englanders he depicted in his poems. He sets the majority of his stuff in New England. Let's point out just for a second for your notes, the regionalism that seems to be a quality of a lot of our really influential writers of the 20th century. By regionalism, I mean the following. They set their work in a certain region of the United States. Faulkner, Welty, the South. Here, Frost, the New England, the Northeast, okay? Although he eventually received 4 Pulitzer Prizes and read at a presidential inauguration, Frost's success as a poet did not come overnight or easily. Only after years of rejection by publishers did he achieve the acceptance for which he had worked so hard. The first heading, Early Struggles. Frost was born in San Francisco, California, which is ironic because he'll spend the majority of his life writing about New England, but he was actually born in San Francisco. His father died when Frost was 11. His mother moved the family to the textile city of Lawrence, Massachusetts. After graduating from high school, Frost briefly attended Dartmouth College. Disliking college life, he left school. What do you know? Another dropout. See how this is consistent? He left school and spent time working as a farmer, mill hand, journalist, and school teacher. During his spare time, he wrote poetry and dreamed of someday being able to support himself solely by writing. The next heading, The English Years. Frost married and spent 10 years farming in New Hampshire. In 1912, unable to get his poems published, he moved his family to England. While living in England, Frost befriended a number of well-known poets, including Ezra Pound. Let's just pause for a moment and point out that while we only had one little essay by Pound called A Few Don'ts, and then that famous little poem of 14 words, Metro, Ezra Pound's name keeps coming up again and again as the one who's so influential in meeting the up-and-coming brand new poets, the important young poets, and here we go again with Ezra Pound's name. And, we're back reading, succeeded in publishing 2 collections of poetry, A Boy's Will in 1913 and North of Boston in 1914. When he returned to the United States in 1915, Frost found that his success in England had spread across the Atlantic. He was on the road to fame. Critical acclaim. Next heading. Frost published several more volumes of poetry for which he received many awards. He taught and lectured at dozens of schools and continued to farm in Vermont and New Hampshire. I think this is significant. Let's put it in your notes. One of the things that I think makes Frost so important is that he continued to farm. He continued to work on into his professional poetry years. In 1960, at John F. Kennedy's invitation, Frost became the first poet to read his work at a presidential inauguration. We'll even read some lines from that. Gift will be the abbreviated title. Final heading, Deeper Meanings. Frost's poetry was popular with both critics and the general public. He used traditional verse form and conversational language to paint vivid portraits of New England. Despite their apparent simplicity, however, his poems are filled with profound meanings. Like his poetry, Frost's personality also had multiple levels. In his public appearances, Frost presented himself as a folksy farmer who just happened to write poetry. In reality, however, Frost was a deep thinker whose darker, complicated personality sometimes mystified those who knew him. I really like this quote on 873. It's a significant one. Let's write it down. It is one that speaks exactly to what Frost thought of what poetry ought to be. We did several poems. You'll remember Marianne Moore's poem Poetry and the McLeish offering that tried to answer what makes a great poem. I love this quote. Let's put it in your notes. Like a piece of ice on a hot stove, the poem must ride on its own melting. It's an incredible word picture, right? So you take a chunk of ice and you drop it on a hot stove and it just kind of sits there and simmers, right? He says that's what a great poem has to be able to do. All right, let's jump over to 872 really quickly in literary analysis, and let's talk through the information at 2B for rhetoric. Robert Frost wove sound and sense into his poems that are among the best loved in American literature. He often wrote in blank verse, let's write that down, or unrhymed iambic pentameter, which mimics the sound of natural speech. Now, let's remind ourselves what iambic is. Ba-bum, right? Ba-bum, ba-bum. So notice here, we'll begin with our 3 bullet points. The basic unit of meter is a foot, which is usually one stressed syllable and one unstressed syllable. You'll notice that the stressed syllable gets that little mark, and the unstressed syllable gets that almost like a little V or a little U mark, okay? The most common, point 2, the most common foot in English is the iamb. One unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, ba-bum, right? So an unstressed stressed, unstressed stressed, ba-bum, okay? A line containing 5 of these, ba-bum, 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 is iambic pentameter, right? We're going to see this in a lot. Just look at 875 really quickly. And let's just look at the first couple of lines just to make sure you understand how this works. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straight or darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. Do you see it? I like to think some boy's been swinging them. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Do you see it? Watch my hands. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. 5. That ba-bum, unstressed stress, is an iambic foot. Okay? And so what we're saying is that Frost loves to play the game of closed form, all right? While at the same time he's going to obviously play the game of delivery of a powerful message to us. Keep reading. The use of iambic pentameter, blank verse, and other meters affect the sound and mood of a poem. Notice these effects as you read. Many of Frost's poems, including 5 in this grouping, can be categorized as, let's write this down, pastorals. Pastorals, there's another word for you. Poems that deal with rural settings, okay? Traditional pastorals present idealized views of rural life. In Frost's hands, however, rural life can be fraught with ethical lapses, accident, and conflict. As you read these poems, examine their portrayals of rural life and notice the ways in which setting contributes to meaning. We'll obviously point this out as we go. In your reading strategy on page 872, they're going to say one way to clarify the essential meaning of poems is to read poetry in sentences rather than in poetic lines. In other words, we are not, when we read, you'll notice this when we read these poems together, we're not going to stop and take a break at the end of a line. We're going to read the thought instead of the line. I would write that down. We're going to read the thought instead of the line. And the thought may actually take several lines. And so we're going to read following our punctuation, I guess is a good way to say it. Do notice the 3 vocabulary words at the bottom of 872 as well, all right? All right, we're going to turn to our first of several Frost offerings, Birches. I'm with you now on 875. And let's start with the background information up at the top. Robert Frost spent most of his life in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, a heavily forested region of the United States. One of the most common trees of this region is the birch. Obviously, we've seen it out here as well, right? A tall, slender tree with white bark and small, dainty leaves. Think of aspen, right? Think of aspen. Despite its graceful trunk, though, the birch is by no means delicate. Its wood is dense, hardy, and flexible. The birch is by no means delicate. Its wood is dense, hardy, and flexible, right? This is going to be significant. That's why I reread it. And its bark is practically waterproof, which made it a popular canoe covering among Native Americans. In this poem, Frost celebrates the Birches' resilience and suggests that the human spirit shares this quality. I would read that again, and that obviously you want to write down in 2a. In this poem, Frost celebrates the Birches' resilience. That means toughness, okay? And suggests that the human spirit shares this quality. And obviously, because Frost is such a poet of America, many Americans will hold to Walt Whitman and Robert Frost as representative of what it means to be an American poet, especially in the 20th century. Let's turn to the poem now. And we've already pointed out for you at 2b that we're looking at this blank verse iambic pentameter, right? Okay. Well, notice that we don't have any kind of a rhyme scheme or anything like that, right? But we do have the rhythm there. But when I read this poem, notice, there's two ways for me to read it. I've already played the game once. Let's play it again. When I see birches bend to left and right, across the lines of straight or darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay. Right? Okay, you can hear that. But when I read the poem now, I'm not going to read it emphasizing the iambic pentameter stuff. I'm just simply going to read the poem, okay? Now, as we read the poem, I'm going to ask you really quickly at 2b to write down this word. What are the major symbols, S-Y-M-B-O-L, of this poem? Okay? Now, like a lot of reading that we have done together, at first, things look really simple, right? An old lady walking through the woods going to town. I mean, how hard can it be? Eudora Welty's Worn Path. But once we start getting into the poem, reading at level 2 and 3, we find that there's all kinds of implications of what's going on in that story. And then, of course, I'm not saying you got to like this stuff. I'm saying you learn to respect this stuff, to appreciate this stuff. You start to see how it works. We'll see the same thing happening with this poem here, okay? Birches. Let's just read the poem through one time, and when I finish, I'm not going to say anything. I'm just simply going to ask you, can you jot down at level 1 what is for you the major stuff that's going on in this poem? Now you can see already, scan it. I'm going to read from 875 to 876, so it's you know, a poem of some length. All right? So let's sit up, really concentrate, and see how much of this poem you can take in. All right? Let's go to work with it. Birches. When I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, I like to think some boy's been swinging. But swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. Often, you must have seen them loaded with ice, sunny winter morning after a rain. They click upon themselves as the breeze rises and turn many-colored as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel. Soon, the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away, you'd think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. They are dragged to the withered bracken by the load, and they seem not to break. Though once they are bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arcing in the woods, years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun. But I was going to say, when truth broke in with all her matter of fact about the ice storm, I should prefer to have some boy bend them as he went out and in to fetch the cows. Some boy too far from town to learn baseball, whose only play was what he found himself, summer or winter, and could play alone. One by one, he subdued his father's trees by writing them down over and over again until he took the stiffness out of them. And not one but hung limp. Not one was left for him to conquer. He learned all there was to learn about not launching out too soon, and so not carrying the tree away clear to the ground. He always kept his poise, the top branches climbing carefully with the same pains he used to fill a cup up to the brim and even above the brim. Then he flung outward, feet first with a swish, kicking his way down through the air to the ground. So was I once myself a swinger of birches, and so I dream of going back to be. It's when I'm weary of considerations and life is too much like a pathless wood, where your face burns and tickles with the cobwebs broken across it, and one eye is weeping from a twig's having lashed across it open. I'd like to get away from earth a while, and then come back to it, and begin over. May no fate willfully misunderstand me, and half grant that I wish to snatch me away, not to return. Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. I'd like to go by climbing a birch tree, and climb black branches up a snow-white trunk toward heaven, till the tree could bear no more, but dipped its top and set me down again. There would be good, that would be good, both going and coming back. One could do worse than be a swinger of birches. All right, let's pause for a moment. Jot down at level 1. For example, if you walk out of 303 and somebody says, dude, what did the loony cover with you today? You can say, this crazy cat named Robert Frost in this poem called Birches. Really, what was it about? Because birch is a tree. Yeah, it was about a tree. That we know. But can you write down at level 1, what's this poem about? What is this poem about? What happens in this poem? Now, obviously, we're going to exegete together. But at this point in our time together, you should already begin to be able to kind of put in your own words what you think is happening in these poems. Let's begin by the speaker. Now, let's point this out. You cannot always assume that the speaker of the poem is the poet. So let's say that at 2b. You cannot always assume that. However, in this poem, we do have an old man speaking. And how do we know he's an old man? Well, by the end of the poem, it's clear that he's reflecting back on this notion of tree swinging. Now, this is something that many of my students don't know about, because the trees that we have out here where we live in Wyoming, a little bit different. Although I've had students that say, I've done this with willow trees before, where you climb up into the tree, you grab hold of the branches, you jump, and you hold on to the branch, and the branch then bends down. Now, if you miscalculate, you can hit the floor and obviously hurt yourself, okay? So you have to kind of know how far up the tree to go, and you jump out, and then the branch just folds you over. Now, if you've ever seen willow trees, you know you can do this. Obviously, it's dangerous to do this, right? But you can do this, and it's a form of entertainment. In our poem, maybe entertainment of a young boy who lives out in the middle of nowhere, and therefore he can't play baseball, and so he has to find his own games. And one game is this jumping out, tree swinging, right? By the end of the poem, the old man says, if I had to choose the way I want to go. And all of a sudden, it's a really interesting word picture where you got this old fart climbing up into a tree, and everybody's like, dude, what's he doing? And he climbs up into the tree, and all of a sudden he grabs a bunch of the branches, and somebody's like, dude, I think he's going to jump or something, right? He says, well, that would be a fine way to go. I mean, if you got to go, that's a great way to go. In other words, in your old age, returning to the thing you did, what? When you were very young, right? Let's take a look now at the poem itself. It's constructed, interestingly, into 2 parts. Did you notice this? First, it almost seems like it's just a essay, a poetic essay, on the birch tree itself. The sturdiness of the birch tree, we wrote down earlier this word, the resilience of the birch tree. Let's go through it really quickly. He says, when I see birches bend to left and right across the lines of straighter, darker trees, because the trees are flexible and therefore they can bend, I like to think some boy's been swinging them. So at the very beginning of the poem, we begin with where we're going to end, the swinging of a tree. And again, if you don't understand what this means, the swinging of a tree, like some boy picks up the tree and swings it like he would a bat or something. No. It's engaging in the tree by crawling up into the tree, grabbing hold, jumping out. And of course, we should point out that this is dangerous business the higher up you go. And in fact, there are, recorded deaths of young boys who jumped to their death. You could jump out and then lose your hand and then fall. The branch could snap and break and then you would fall. And as we said before, if you don't calculate well, you can jump out you can fall. The tree would have caught you. The only problem is the branches were still bending as you hit the floor. So it's a science and an art form of a kind, and obviously there's an exhilaration and a danger involved in it, right? Out here at 3B, for example, to compare, we might write something down like what people do out here that's kind of crazy, and others look at us and go, well, you got to be nuts, like rock climbing, for example, in the canyon, which some people think is kind of crazy, especially if you do it without ropes, which is something we don't recommend, right? He then says, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay as ice storms do. And all of a sudden now he shifts. Now, we've seen this, of course, out here as well. When we get certain kinds of snow ice that's really, really heavy, and then it lays on the branches of the tree, and then the tree just kind of goes right to the ground. And then, of course, as the sun melts, off drops all of the ice, but the branches sometimes don't go all the way back up the way they are supposed to. A lot will depend upon the flexibility of the branches, right? The birch will, in fact, lean over and then it can come back up, but sometimes not all the way to its original shape. So he's going to describe this. Notice all the S sounds as the stir cracks and crazes their enamel lining. Soon the sun's warmth makes them shed crystal shells, shattering and avalanching on the snow crust. Such heaps of broken glass to sweep away. I'm obviously emphasizing that hard sibilant, that S sound. And then all of a sudden he says, you think the inner dome of heaven had fallen. He continues by talking about this. They're dragged to the withered bracken by the load. In other words, down they go. And they seem not to break, though once they're bowed so low for long, they never right themselves. You may see their trunks arching in the woods years afterwards, trailing their leaves on the ground. And then a compelling and an interesting word picture, right? These trees that lay over and continue to grow, but they don't grow upright anymore. They kind of grow out. He says they're kind of like, look at the word picture, what do we call that? A comparison using like or as a simile, right? Take a look at it at line 19. These trees are like girls on hands and knees that throw their hair before them over their heads to dry in the sun.